Welcome back to the Making International in Korea, the video series. In this video, I'll be explaining to you on national security law. The purpose of the national security law of Korea is allegedly to secure the security of a nation and the survival and the liberty of the people by regulating anti-state activities that might threaten the security of the nation. The law, however, has been criticized by human rights groups. The law posits the South Korean government is only legitimate governments all over the peninsula, and that the North is illegitimate liberal group to overthrow to South. Consequently, many activities which might aid in side with the North end up being punished, drastically and curtailing individual freedom of speech and expression. According to paragraph 1, article 7 of the law, anyone who praise, encourage, or promote the activities of the North or side with them, or promote or instigate a national upheaval is likely to face up to 7 years of imprisonment. According to paragraph 4, article 7 of the law, anyone who produces or spread a fact that is not true or that is likely to disturb the society is to face up to 2 years of imprisonment. Moreover, anyone who makes, imports, copies, transports, spreads, sells and acquires a document or drawing for the purpose of above mentioned shall be punished. The article has its own origin from Article 4 of the Anti-Communism Act, whose purpose was to block the activities of a communist considered to be threatening the national security and strengthening anti-communist system. The Anti-Communism Act was abolished in 1980, but Article 4 of the Act has been incorporated in the National Security Act. In many cases, various types of pro-democracy movements under the military dictatorship before the democratization, including civic groups' activities to promote North and South relations, communicating with the North Koreans visiting North Korea, had been punished by the law. After Korea's democratization, the threat of punishment that the law used to oppress civil society and political dissidents drastically decreased, but the possibility of the law to be used for political reasons still remains. In 1998, a professional artist who painted a picture entitled Lies Are Planning, in Korean term 모내기, was found guilty by the Supreme Court for violating Article 7 of the law. The court held that the painting was an enemy of benefiting expression and should be confiscated from him. In year 2004, the Human Rights Committee under the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights points out that it was a violation of Article 19, freedom of expression, of the covenants, and the effective remedy should be provided. In the concluding observations, the Human Rights Committee points out that the wording of Article 7 of the law is unreasonably vague and could have a chilling effect on public dialogue and could unnecessarily and disproportionately interfere with the freedom of opinion and expression. I recommend that the Article 7 of the law should be abrogated because it does not permit restrictions on the expression of ideas merely because they coincide with those held by the enemy entity or may be considered to create apathy for the entity. Let me touch upon another case of death penalty. Generally speaking, there are two conflicting arguments regarding the issue of death penalty. The first issue is whether it violates the rights to life, while the second issue revolves around whether the death penalty is effective in preventing crimes from happening. Article 41 of the Criminal Law of Korea stipulates death penalty as one of the implemented legal penalties. While international human rights bodies, including Human Rights Committee under the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights, have recommended Korea to abolish death penalty, the Korean Constitutional Court held in 2010 that death penalty, which has a legitimate goal to prevent crime through psychological threats and accomplish the justice through fair amounts of distribution, is constitutional and not a violation of the rights to life. According to Korean criminal law, several severe crimes, including insurrection, inducement of foreign aggression, taking side with enemy, spying would be punished by death sentence. Since the establishment of the Korean government in 1948, around 1,300 people had been executed. Most recently, in 1997, the Korean government executed 23 prisoners on death row, and since then, it stopped executing death penalty. In 2007, International Amnesty categorized South Korea as a country that retains death penalty in law, but has not executed for at least 10 years. There have been several legal challenges to make death penalty unconstitutional in Korea. In 2010, however, Korea Constitutional Court ruled that death penalty is not a violation of human dignity and value guaranteed by Article 10 of the Constitution, and has a legitimate purpose to protect the public interest, including protection people's lives through prevention of crimes and security of the society. There are several cases where death sentences were abused to oppress political opponents and ordinary people. For example, in 1959, Jo Bong-am, at the time the leader of Progress Party and political rival of then-President Lee Seung-man, was sentenced to death and executed for alleged espionage. In 2007, Truth and Reconciliation Commission declared that a sentence and execution as a political oppression which denied humanity and human rights, and in 2011, the Supreme Court found him not guilty through retrial. On April 4, 1974, the Supreme Court ruled the death sentence rendered by the military tribunal to 8 civilians who were accused of allegedly having attempted to topple the government. The civilians were severely tortured and prevented from meeting their families and lawyers. The trial was not made available to the media, and the accused were prevented from presenting their cases. They were all executed without being allowed to meet their families within 18 hours after the death sentences. Their bodies were cremated without their families' consent. In 2006, 3 decades after their execution, they were found not guilty by a retrial. Their families were allowed the military compensation, but no criminal prosecution was pursued. The 2 cases mentioned above are called murder by the judiciary, which means the death sentence ought to be executed by death sentence even if innocent. The lesser-known facts regarding this issue involve Kim Dae-jung, a former president of Korea, and the Nobel laureates, who had been arrested for allegedly orchestrating the demonstrations in Gwangju in 1980-81. and was sentenced to death penalty by the military regime. The allegation was well-organized tactic by military to remove the power politician from politics. He became the president himself of Korea in 1998 and made a huge contribution to Korea's democratization, which has been previously ruled by the military regime for decades. The case of Korea shows how innocent people could be faced with the death penalty for political purpose. In May 1961, the then Army General Park Chung-hee toppled the democratically elected government. Under his iron fist rule, a gross amount of human rights violation was committed. Opposition leaders and anti-government activities were severely oppressed. He perpetuated his presidency by revising Constitution in 1972. The president was elected by indirect election, and as such, the president would no longer need to campaign for votes from people. The powers of legislature and the judicial branch were drastically curtailed. According to new constitution, called the Yushin Constitution, the president could take, by presidential decree, an emergency measure on any matter. The president had the power to suspend individuals' fundamental rights and freedom at any time, if necessary, and take an emergency measure on the judicial power. Under his rule, those who were against the government or expressed any kinds of a complaint on government policy were arrested without warrant, tortured, imprisoned, sometimes put to death sentence. Army General Chun Doo-hwan seized power through the military coup in December 1979 after Park was assassinated by the chief of the intelligence agency. In May 1980, Gwangju civilians in the southwestern province of Korea stood up against the government and its brutal oppression of the people, which is the May 18 Gwangju democratization movement. The government reacted with military violence, and around 200 people lost their lives to restore democracy. Under the John's military regime, widespread human rights violations were committed. Acts of torture, using beating, electronic shock, rape, and arrest without warrants were normally committed. Students and oppositions, politicians were framed with accusations of being North Korean spies and sympathizers. In June 1987, the Korean people held demonstrations to refuse the continuation of military rule, which is the June 10 uprising. The military regime succumbed to people's power, and the rule finally ended in 1992, paving the way to democracy. Under the two presidents, Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, the democracy of Korea drastically progressed, and many steps were taken to protect human rights. In year 2001, the National Human Rights Commission was established as a national human rights advocacy institution. The several Truth and Reconciliation Commissions were established to investigate human rights violations under previous authoritarian regimes. The report prepared by the commissions turned out to be very helpful in that they were used as a legal ground for victims to get a new trial and compensation. Under the conservative presidents of the Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye, which followed by the liberal regime again, human rights protection deteriorated, including rights to political participation and the freedom to expression. The independence of the National Human Rights Commission was in danger due to the government's intervention. In the 2012 presidential election, the various government agencies were involved in an illegal election campaign, and the government secretly maintained a blacklist to oppress the political opponents. The development of democracy has been a critical factor in enhancing human rights protection in Korea.